We are doing a series called Building a Relational Toolbox. And just by way of quick review, you'll have to imagine tool number one, which is my bicycle air pump, because I left it at home. So imagine that I have a pump and I am pumping up the tires of my bike. And the tool represents what kind of relationships are we trying to do. We are trying to create life-giving relationships. That bike is going nowhere without that air pump. The second one is the stud finder, not Mark Jackson, but the stud finder. And what a stud finder does is that it finds that stud behind that the sheetrock there to where you can hang, if you want to hang pictures or a bookshelf or something like that. And if I think of any one tool that I would not want to do without, it is this one. And the idea of this is to try to understand what's going on inside of the person you're talking to. What are they feeling? What are their intentions? What would they like to see happen? And whatever it is they're going through, there is just something refreshing about having somebody that seems to understand what you're going through. This is an important tool. Our third one is glue. And we use the thing of glue to illustrate that of regarding conflict. And the goal of conflict is to be closer after the conflict than you are before. Our fourth one is the battery charger. And we looked at this a couple weeks ago. And the battery charger is necessary because we all run out of batteries in terms of relating to people and being other-centered, trying to create life-giving relationships. And we need something stronger than ourselves to do that. And the way that this happens in our relationship with God is we trust Him for what we need, but also what we are trying to do is adding value and creating meaning to our relationships and to the people around us. Those are two really, really important tools to build strong relationships, adding value and creating meaning in those relationships and with those people. And today we come to our fifth relational effect and relational impact. And the tool that we're using for this is simple pencil and pad. Now, I happen to know somebody in our church who loves to draw, and I was going to ask you to bring some of your drawings. But every time Truman makes something, I don't know how many drawings you have done ahead of time to do that. If you've ever had a carpenter in your house, they always have that flat, big, fat pencil up here, and they have their pad, and they're always making drawings of what they want to create. In this sense, there are two tools that this represents that we're going to look at today: relational effect and relational impact. Several years ago, I was talking to a woman that none of you know. She lives in a different part of the country. She was visiting here. I've been married 18 years, had 3 children, and as we were talking, I could tell that something was really bothering her. And I said, now, you don't know me that well, but you look like you have the weight, you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Would you like to tell me, is something going on? And she paused, and then she said, well, yes. Just recently, I had a big conflict with my husband, and he just erupted in anger over the smallest of things. And it just took me by such shock. How could you be so angry about such a small thing? And it was just so unwarranted and so undeserved, and I got sort of this harsh response. Now, what she was experiencing were the two things that are our topic for today. She was experiencing his relational, or the result of her relational effect on him, and her long-term relational impact on him. She could clearly see his relational effect on her. That just made me so angry, so unwarranted. What she could not see is her relational effect on him in the moment, and her relational impact on him over a long period of time. That's what this. We have to have some definitions here. Relational effect is what is my relational effect in the moment, or the relational effect, what results from how I'm relating to somebody in the moment. And relational impact is, what is the result of how I generally relate to this person over a long period of time? Now, what she was experiencing without being able to see it was, there was something coming out of her attitude, her approach, her relational style that was annoying to him, that triggered something angry in him. And that was an initial response. But why was he over the top, unwarranted, over something small? And that was that she was experiencing her long-term relational impact on him. In other words, it wasn't just that he was experiencing a certain attitude that in the moment that made him irritated and angry. He was experiencing the same irritant and attitude that he had experienced over a long period of time, and suddenly it just erupted. It was the tip of the iceberg, we would say, for him. Of course, she could not see any of that. All she could see was his poor relational effect upon her. Now, when you think about relational style, all of us relate to people in two general categories. Most of what we think about are words. That's the thing. We have a conversation, and that's what I think of as the visible conversation. I'm speaking, the other person is speaking, the conversation is going. But the second aspect of our conversation is what I think of as the invisible conversation, though it's not really invisible. It's somewhat invisible. But it's also the attitudes, not just our words, but the attitudes by which a person is perceiving us. And under the word attitude, I'm using it as an umbrella term. This can be our one attitude that's pervading out of us, or several attitudes that are coursing together at the same time. It's our tone of voice, our facial expressions, how we look, our attentiveness or lack of attentiveness. There are lots of different things that go into this. Every conflict usually begins with a difference about words, a disagreement. But it's not long before a conflict gets on steroids because of the second aspect. We start reacting to each other's relational style regarding attitudes, their actions, their lack of attentiveness, an eye roll, a sneer, something that we're not sensing in the second part. That is our relational effect. Relational effect. Proverbs deals with some of these things. Proverbs 15:28. The heart of the righteous weighs its answers. The mouth of the wicked gushes evil. The righteous person is thinking before he or she speaks. And the illustration here is they weigh ahead of time what they're going to say. Ephesians 4:29. Let no rotting word come out of your mouth, but only such as is good for edifying, as fits the occasion, that it may impart grace to those who hear. Three really good things to ponder before the words come tumbling out of your mouth. What Paul is saying here, think about your relational effect. And here are three good things to point to that you want to communicate to that person you're communicating with. Proverbs 10:13. Wisdom is found on the lips of the discerning. You are discerning your relational effect or relational impact on somebody. But a rod is for the back of one who has no sense. No sense. Proverbs 11:22. Like a gold ring and a pig's snout. Picture that. A beautiful gold ring. Then you take that gold ring and attach it to the pig's snout. That's the image that Solomon is using here. Such like that is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. Same kind of idea. Proverbs 13:3. He who guards his lips guards his soul, but he who speaks rashly will come to ruin or conflict or relationships that are slowly cracking and slowly breaking. Proverbs 10:14. The wise store up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool invites ruin. What my fairly new friend in the illustration that I used at the beginning of this message did not know was that she was doing in the process that last verse there, Proverbs 10:14. The mouth of a fool, which in that moment was her, invites ruin, but she thought the ruin was because of him. She could not see her relational effect and long-term relational impact with him. Now, our story revolves around three characters in the Old Testament that happened about 3,000 years ago over in Israel. One is King David, who is not quite king yet, but he was the David that defeated Goliath and became a national hero. And King Saul became so envious of him that he thought it prudent to kill David. And so David took off for the wilderness, and over time he had gathered about 600 men to protect him who were loyal to David. And he's out in the middle of the wilderness, sort of trying to hide, keep himself and his men safe from Saul and his 3,000-man army who are trying to undo him. Two other characters in our story are Nabal and Abigail, and we pick up the story in 1 Samuel 25, verse 3. Character number 2, his name was Nabal. His wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. Now, Nabal, the name in Hebrew means fool. Now, back then, people were named after some type of character. And so I really like to meet the mother and father who decided to name their son Fool. I'm sure there's a story there somewhere. But he was a very rich rancher, huge herds, and over the course of time, it became shearing season and time to haul in all these sheep and collect the money for after a year of being out in the wilderness. Abigail is an amazing woman. Even though she's married to Nabal, which I think in some way makes this even more amazing. How did she pull off something like that? Well, while David and his men are out there in the wilderness, Nabal's ranchers bring their sheep up over a mountain range and down into some ravines and down into a valley where they can graze for a whole season, spring and summer. And while they're there, David, who's also in that area with his 600 men, decides to do something on his own initiative. He decides to protect Nabal's ranchers who are with him and all of his herds from marauders, bandits, thieves. And in that day, if you did not have a significant amount of men to protect your herd, you could get wiped out in a day. Now, David did not have a contract, a legal document. He didn't even have a gentleman's agreement to do this. He was just out there in the wilderness with his men, and he sees Nabal's herds, these large herds and these ranchers, and he knows about marauders, and he just takes it upon himself to protect these herds on his own initiative, just because it's the right thing to do. And at the end of that season, roughly about 6 months or so, David sends some men back over the mountains, back to where Nabal's ranch is, and asks him to provide food and wine or drink for his men who've done this. Nabal hears word of this, and instead of thinking, wow, we are so thankful that you protected us and I still have all my herds and all this, he says, who is this David? There are many scoundrels about right now that would take advantage of someone like me. And Nabal is completely irritated. And this is where we start to see Abigail's response as she sees this crisis that's beginning to unfold. Now, as it relates to our topic of relational effect and relational impact, there are 4 important things that would be for us to see about our relational effect. The first one is, we'll see it with her, is her approach. The approach that she has with David. There's something he senses in her as she goes to meet him. Second is her actions, which we'll look at. Third is her attitude, or actually there's probably several attitudes that you could discern in Abigail here. But the question that we should really ask here is, what is the prevailing attitude that I tend to portray? What is the general attitude that people portray out of my relational style? And fourth is her appeal. Finally, lastly, it's her words. Those four elements are really, really important if you want to ask some important questions about your relational style. What do people sense in my approach? What do they see in my actions? What do they sense in my attitude, specifically my prevailing attitude? And then the nature of my words. Those four things. All right, well, let's look at this amazing woman, Abigail, and how she responds to this. The men of David who had gone to Nabal to request food and wine, and they hear this harsh man, no, there's nothing coming your way. They go back to David, and David is infuriated. And he overreacts. He wants to have revenge, and he wants to kill Nabal and every male that Nabal has. Now, obviously, that's a bad thing to do. He shouldn't do that. But to try to understand something of this, imagine that you had a contractor come to your house that you know. And the contractor came and you worked out sort of what you thought was a gentleman's agreement with the contractor. And they would do, and it took about 6 months to do this major renovation of your house. At the end of 6 months of renovation, you decided you didn't like what the contractor did and you were not going to pay him a dime. This is what David was at. He had spent all that time with his 600 men protecting Nabal's flocks and those ranchers, their very lives. And Nabal is not going to give him a dime. Well, when the ranchers, when they hear this, they go back to Abigail and tell her this. And she immediately realizes the crisis underfoot. Here's where we start the story with Abigail. And watch how Abigail does these four things in the course of this story. One of the servants told Abigail, this is 1 Samuel 25, verse 14. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us, speaking of David's men. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us of protection. The whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over, as they say to Abigail, and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. And he is such a wicked man, meaning Nabal, her husband, that no one can talk to him. Now she hears this and she immediately takes the initiative. She hears that all he had asked for was food and wine for the 600 men. So she immediately gets some of the ranch hands to get some donkeys out of the stable and load them up with food and wine. And she gets on one of these donkeys and they traipse up over the mountain range and down into the ravines, where they meet David and 400 of his men coming over a different mountain range, and they come into a ravine. Now, one particular artist has put together this picture here of this meeting here between David and Abigail. And remember, David is livid. He has revenge on his mind. He is murderous. He has completely lost control of himself. And she is going here to appeal to him. And this is a master at work. The first thing we see is something of her approach and her actions. And so as we read these next few verses, I'd like for you to think about, what do you see or sense in her approach? And then more clearly, what do you see in her actions? And then ask yourself, what is the effect of these? What effect does this have on a livid, hell-bent on revenge David? Verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David, and with her face to the ground, she fell at his feet. This is the first thing that you see here. The first thing David sees is her actions. She takes the initiative and she comes over, she bows down before David. The next thing he sees is that her face goes down to the ground, and then at some point she must have moved closer to him with her face at his feet. Verse 24, pardon your servant, my Lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Now, as I've studied this the last couple of weeks especially, I'm thinking, what's the nature of her approach? And the easy thing to start with is, what does she not do that would be so natural for us to do? She's not argumentative. She's not scolding him for his bent on revenge and murder. She's not defensive. And she's not going into debate mode. That's sort of the low-hanging fruit. Even some of that fruit's just on the ground. But there's something else that you sense here in her. There's something that is completely disarming. Something that we would say, never saw that coming. Something very unexpected here in her manner or her demeanor. And the two words that strike me as really powerful here, that catch his attention, is there's a sense of innocence about her and a sense of vulnerability. And both of these things he never saw coming. You would have thought he would have seen a strident woman who's going to stand up for her husband and stand up for her family, and how dare he do this? That's not at all. And you see that this completely takes him by surprise. The next thing, so that's her approach and her actions. The next thing we dive into is, what attitude or attitudes does he perceive in her? And then with that, the more important question is, what is the prevailing attitude? Because that's the effect. That's the relational effect. What attitude is the prevailing one coming out of her? Verse 25. Please pay no attention, my Lord, to that wicked man Nabal. Now she's talking about her husband. He is just like his name. His name means fool. And folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent. Now, there are different words that strike me here, and you might come up with different words. But if I was in David's shoes, there are 4 different things that struck me. One was a tremendous sense of humility here with her. She doesn't have an agenda that you sense. She's on a mission to get something done. You don't sense that here. Humility. Second, something of meekness. Meekness is not weakness. But we would say she's putting herself out there. Similar to vulnerability. You sense that she's asking for mercy that's not deserved. But the one that is my favorite out of this here has to do with our second message, and that's the one on understanding. There is nothing so powerful when somebody is angry and they tell you why they're angry, and you can say something like, I can understand why you'd feel that way. When somebody does that with me, whether it's anger or whether discouragement or whether I'm despondent or whatever it is, and somebody says to me, Seth, I can understand why you'd feel that way. There's something in me that goes, yes, yes. It is such a rare thing. And yet, this is the crux of her words right here. I understand why you would be enraged, why you'd want to kill Nabal, all of our sons, all of our ranchers, maybe even me. I get that. No, she doesn't agree with that, but she gets it. And that is part of her relational effect on David. That's her prevailing attitude, in my opinion. And then we come to Abigail's appeal. And here we get to words. Now, she's used words up until this time, but her words have largely been a tool, not of her appeal or an argument. Her words have been tools of her approach, coordinated with her actions, and underscoring her attitudes. All of that is preparatory, prior to the words of her appeal. Let's look at this, verse 26. Now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. Now, when I think about this situation, when it comes time for us to make our appeal, when we're in a crisis situation or even just a conflict, inevitably, the words that come out of our mouth are almost always driven by our self-interest. I just want to say what I need to say. I just need to say how I feel. I just need to put that out there. You don't see this with Abigail. In fact, you hardly see any self-interest in her appeal until the last 3 words of her appeal later on in this story. There is not 1 ounce of self-interest that's coming through her relational effect on David. In fact, her appeal is really geared around his interests. His interest. In your handout, Abigail's appeal is to the man David most deeply desires to be in the moment and his highest aspirations about his future. This lady is right on target. Oh, that more and more of us would think like this. His deepest desires and highest aspirations. And you see that in verse 26. As surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, the Lord has kept you from bloodshed. She's thinking about him. What would have happened if he had gone through with this? And from avenging yourself with your own hands. What would have happened if you had gone through with this? May your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. He has a lot of enemies. He's going to have a lot of enemies, not just King Saul, but the nations around him. And she's thinking about that day when he's going to be king and he's going to face enemies, and hopefully he'll be successful. He wants to be successful over his enemies. She can see that. She puts words to that. This is just astounding that any human being can do this. Verse 27, she continues, and let this gift of the food and wine, all these donkeys, which your servant has brought to my Lord, be given to the men who follow you. That should have been done by Nabal. He did not do that. This seems like a no-brainer to her. It is a no-brainer. Verse 28, please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you will live. Again, she is thinking about him. There's not 1 ounce of self-interest in what she's saying. It's tremendously disarming, and not just disarming, but heartening. It reinforces the kind of man that David aspires to be and the kind of character that he aspires to have. Now, I've put a few of these in your handout. I'm sure there's more that can be mined out of this passage. What are David's deepest aspirations? Well, he wants to be a man that follows God and honors God well. Now, is he on the road to doing that at the moment? Of course not. But when she pulls that card out and highlights that thing, it reminds him of the kind of man he yearns to be. Second, he has a godly desire to triumph over real enemies of the nation, and he knows that God must help. He wants to be in that position where God will help. The inference is if he takes revenge and bloodshed here, might not have the help he's going to need. Third, he wants his life to count for God in the long run. He's about to torpedo that. Number 4, he wants to be a man of integrity. Now, there's not a scolding here or a guilt trip. She's just raising his aspirations. She's putting words to his deepest desires and his aspirations. Verse 29. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. but the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pockets of a sling. So she has the picture of, she draws a picture of, you might think of a cloth, a tablecloth. And that God wants to take David and put David, curl him up in that tablecloth and wrap up the four corners and tie around and lift that up and tie it to the end of a stick. And God is carrying this stick with David in the bundle. This is the vision she puts in front of him. This is who he desires to be and who he'll need to be in his many battles that he's about to fight. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. Verse 30. When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. Now, what does she know about life? Same thing David does. When you and I act rashly and do something incredibly stupid, though it feels so important at this moment to do that, when it's all said and done, we feel like a complete moron. We say things like, how could I have done that? I know better. How could I have done that? And what she realizes is that those moments are human. That we can harangue ourselves, sometimes day and night. We call this our skeletons in the closet. And sometimes we can hear those old bones rattle. She knows that sometimes, though, we are certainly forgiven and redeemed, but there is a sadness that can sort of hang over our life because of what we've done. And she says, David, you don't want to be in that position. And I don't want you to be in that position. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, and here is the first phrase of self-interest, and she uses only 3 words. Remember your servant, meaning her, and her interests, her children, her life and her children. Now, as we've looked at, a relational effect and relational impact has 4 elements. The first is our approach. And the second one is what the person sees in our actions as we're relating. The third is our attitudes. And the fourth is our appeal or words. And those things are important. Now, when we reverse the order, which we do without thinking of it, when we reverse that order and start with our words, and then think about our attitudes, and then our actions, and then our approach. This is what generally happens in long-term relationships. I put this in your handout. When we reverse the order, or when we just react with our words first, what may seem like an appeal to us, I'm just trying to appeal, I'm trying to say this nicely, it's often felt by the other person as argumentative and or accusative. And we wonder why. It's because we don't see our relational effect in terms of our approach, our actions, our attitudes, or particularly our prevailing attitude. Now, we finally come to the end here where David speaks. And when I think of what we're about to read here, David, the light bulbs are flashing like crazy for David. He finally sees what she is saying to him. And it sort of reminds me of a dream that maybe you've had. And in that dream, you are doing something incredibly wrong. And you can see in your dream, your movement through this dream towards something that's going to make a complete mess of things. And you just sort of shudder in the middle of your dream. And then suddenly, right at the precipice, or just after the precipice of your actions, you suddenly wake up, haunted by that dream, but realize it's just a dream. There's something of that in these words of David here. Verse 32, David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." That is a master at work on relational effect and relational impact. Now, as we close here, I would like just to think about what was it that she did. She heard initially about this crisis that was going to unfold that would affect her family, and all that was dear to her. And she immediately responded with, what can I do to avert this crisis? And when she heard what happened, she goes to work and she prepares. She has these donkeys prepared with lots of food and wine, and she takes off with the ranchers, the donkeys and wine, and she travels on an old donkey up over the mountains and down into a ravine where she meets David, who she knows is hell-bent on revenge. She humbles herself there in about the most meek way possible. He senses something of an approach that is for him. And that's confirmed by her actions, her attitudes, and her appeal. And it's stunning to him. And he responds. Now, does that story sound familiar? Have you heard another story sort of like that? Well, there's a story that involves you and involves me. And that is a long, long time ago, somebody heard about the train wreck that you and I were going to make with our lives. And that person went, "Oh my gosh, this is a crisis that needs to be avoided." And that person immediately went to work with a plan. What can I do to help protect that stupid, foolish Seth from making a train wreck of his life? And that person came not over the mountains, but out of heaven. Not out of the richness of her ranch home, but the throne room of God. And traveled down into the ravines of a little place called Bethlehem. And humbled himself in the most menial of ways, a little baby, innocent, vulnerable, for our benefit. And with every need at his disposal to meet ours, he came to that point of meeting us humbly, loving us, giving us what we need in a completely disarming way that says, "Oh my gosh, I could have made a train wreck out of my life." That's the gospel. This is why we are here. This is why we sing. Such a wonderful song this morning. Wow. And John, I loved it when you stood up for the first part of that song. That was electric. And I loved your tenor on that. This is why we sing. We've all been Nabal. And what he's doing with all of us is he's making us Abigails. Let's pray together. Father, about 30 minutes ago, probably all of us in here were just stunned by that new song and moved to tears. And there's a reason for that. Because most of us in this room have experienced the wonder of what we sang. We know you like that. That you are worthy. That you have sacrificed yourself. That you do love us at any cost to yourself. And we are the happy recipients of that. Perhaps you're here this morning and you think, I think I'm a lot closer to Nabal than I am to Abigail. We've all been there, and we're still prone to that. But it doesn't have to be that way. You will never be an Abigail without first dealing with the self-interest that rules in your heart as the most important thing. And until that is defeated, you can memorize the text of this message and those 4 A's that Abigail portrayed. And yet, when push Comes to shove, you will start with your words, and you will be affected by somebody else's relational effect to you, and largely blind to your relational effect and impact to the person you're talking to. This is our human nature at work. And Jesus Christ came a long way to change that. If you've never given your heart to Jesus and let him sit on that throne room in your heart instead of self-interest sitting there, this is what the Bible calls repentance and faith. And it's just a simple exchange of who's sitting on that throne. And it can be expressed in some simple words. Lord, I am a sinner. Self-interest rules in the chair. And today, I hate that. I do not want that to be. I want you sitting on the chair. I want to relate to people and live the way you did and the way we see in Abigail today. Please renew me, redeem me, make me a new person. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.